Darkness covered the Boeotian plain as 10,000 Spartan warriors began moving in silence. This was the 11th night of the standoff, and Pausanias, nephew of King Leonidas, who had died at Thermopylae, knew his army was in a desperate situation. No water, no food. Persian cavalry had cut off all supply lines. The only plan was to retreat under the cover of darkness, moving toward Plataea, where there was fresh water. But when dawn broke on August 27th, 479 BCE, Pausanias realized something horrifying. His formation had completely scattered. The center had gotten lost. Athens was isolated, and 10,000 Spartans were standing exposed in open ground, exactly what Mardonius, commander of 100,000 Persian troops, had been waiting for. From afar, Persian war drums sounded. Mardonius thought the Greeks were fleeing. He ordered his entire army to attack. 100,000 warriors began moving like a tsunami, rushing toward the scattered Greek fighters. Was this the end? Would Thermopylae repeat itself, but this time with 10,000 men instead of 300? Or would this be the moment when Sparta finally avenged their king? But to understand why this moment decided the fate of all Western civilization, we must go back a year earlier, to the shadow of Thermopylae. In August 480 BCE, King Leonidas of Sparta and his 300 warriors had stood at the pass of Thermopylae for 3 days before being surrounded and annihilated. Their deaths didn't save Greece. Xerxes, the Persian emperor, marched into Athens and burned the city to the ground. He ravaged the temples, killed the people, and it seemed nothing could stop this massive empire from swallowing all of Greece. But then, at the Straits of Salamis in September, the Greek navy did the unthinkable. They defeated the Persian fleet in a legendary naval battle. Xerxes, watching his ships sink from his golden throne on shore, decided to withdraw to Asia with most of his army. But he didn't leave empty-handed. Xerxes left behind one man, Mardonius, son-in-law and nephew of Darius, cousin of Xerxes himself, and perhaps the most influential person in the entire Persian Empire. Mardonius was the one who had pushed Xerxes to invade Greece in the first place, and now he was given the task of finishing what they had started. He remained with a massive army, over 100,000 warriors from across the Persian Empire, 40,000 elite Persians, 20,000 Medes, 20,000 from Bactria and India, and 1,000 immortals, the most elite guards the ancient world had ever known. Throughout the winter of 480 to 479, Mardonius had tried to divide the Greeks through diplomacy. He offered Athens an attractive deal, any land they wanted in Greece, and he would rebuild all the temples Xerxes had destroyed. This was an incredibly generous offer. But the Athenians, though their city had become ashes, still remembered Thermopylae. They remembered that 300 Spartans had died to protect them, and so they refused. And that drove Mardonius mad. He marched back to Athens with his entire army, and this time he didn't just occupy the city, he devastated it completely. Every building still standing was destroyed. Every remaining temple was leveled. Athens was burned for a second time, and the message was crystal clear. If you don't surrender, this will be your fate. But instead of breaking the Greeks, this action united them. For the first time in history, over 20 Greek city-states, who regularly warred with each other, agreed to fight together under a single commander. And that commander was Pausanias, nephew of King Leonidas. Let me emphasize this. The man given the task of avenging Thermopylae was the direct heir of those who died there. This wasn't just a military battle. This was a personal reckoning. Pausanias brought 10,000 Spartan hoplites, 5,000 Spartiates, the official citizen warriors, and 5,000 periokoi. Some scholars believe these 5,000 Spartiates represented all Spartan males capable of fighting at that time. In other words, Sparta had bet everything on this battle. This was the largest Spartan army ever to leave the Peloponnese, and they were joined by 8,000 Athenians, 5,000 Corinthians, 3,000 Megarians, and thousands of others. In total, about 38,700 hoplites and tens of thousands of light troops, possibly the largest Greek army ever assembled. If you're finding this story compelling, hit like so. I know, historical stories like this need to be retold. In July 479, the two armies met near the small town of Plataea in Boeotia. Mardonius had built a fortified camp on the north bank of the Asopus River, on a vast plain, perfect terrain for his cavalry. Pausanias, knowing cavalry was Persia's most fearsome weapon, positioned his army on low hills to the south, rough terrain where cavalry couldn't operate effectively. Sparta held the right wing, Athens held the left wing, and everyone else was in the middle, a 7-kilometer-long front, just 3 to 4 kilometers from the enemy, and then both sides just stood still. For 2 days, no one moved. The Persians didn't want to leave the plain where their cavalry had the advantage. The Greeks didn't want to descend to the plain where they'd be crushed by cavalry. This was a battle of wills, a chess match played with thousands of lives. Then Mardonius began making moves. He sent cavalry to probe the Greek line, and in the first skirmish, Persian cavalry commander Mecistius was killed. This was a huge morale boost for the Greeks, but Mardonius had more tricks. Over the following days, he used cavalry to harass Greek supply lines. He attacked supply convoys, inflicting heavy casualties. And then, on the 9th day, he did something brutal. His cavalry captured and destroyed the Gargaphia Spring, the Greek army's only water source. The Greeks couldn't use the Asopus River because Persian archers controlled the riverbank. Now Pausanias faced an impossible choice: stay and die of thirst, or try to retreat and possibly be annihilated by Persian cavalry during the movement. He chose the second option and decided to move at night when cavalry couldn't attack effectively. The plan was to withdraw to a new position near Plataea, where there was clean water and they could defend the mountain passes behind them. But everything went wrong from the start. In the darkness, units in the center got lost and ended up scattered in front of Plataea itself. Athens, Sparta, and Tegea, acting as rearguard for the retreat, hadn't even begun moving when dawn broke. Perhaps due to communication errors, perhaps due to disagreement with the decision, but the result was catastrophic. When the first light of morning illuminated the battlefield, Mardonius saw exactly what he had dreamed of. Greek formations completely scattered, chaotic, and apparently fleeing. This is the moment where we began the story. Mardonius didn't hesitate for a second. He ordered his entire army to attack. Pro-Persian Theban hoplites charged into isolated Athens from multiple directions. Persian cavalry, like a tsunami made of horses and steel, crashed into 10,000 Spartans and Tegeans trying to form up. Arrow rain covered the sky. Dust rose like a cloud. And in that moment, everyone thought Thermopylae was repeating, that Sparta would again be destroyed by an overwhelming Persian army. But Pausanias didn't order retreat. Instead, he shouted, "Hold! Form ranks!" And 10,000 Spartan warriors trained from age 7 to obey orders without hesitation did exactly that. They turned around. They locked shields together. They lowered their 3-meter spears. And they formed the wall, the impenetrable wall made of bronze, iron, and pure will. Athens also stopped and formed up to face the Thebans. No one ran. No one retreated. They stood there and fought exactly as Leonidas had done at Thermopylae. But this time, with 10,000 men instead of 300. This time, with space to maneuver. This time, with a chance to win. When Persian cavalry charged, they met a sight no army in the world could overcome: the Spartan phalanx in all its terrifying glory. Spartan spears pierced both men and horses. The horses, encountering a wall of shields and steel, panicked and threw their riders. And then Persian infantry arrived, with Mardonius himself leading on a white horse, wearing resplendent armor. This was the kind of fighting the Greek phalanx was designed for: close combat, armor to armor, steel to steel. The Persians, wearing light robes and pants, with wicker shields and minimal armor, suddenly realized they were facing warriors encased in bronze from head to toe, swinging heavy swords and pushing with shields that could crush bones. Numerical superiority suddenly didn't matter when you could only fight the person directly in front of you. And then, in the midst of battle, something happened that changed everything. A Spartan warrior named Amnestus saw Mardonius riding across the battlefield, shouting orders, thinking he had won. Amnestus picked up a rock, not a spear, not a sword, just an ordinary rock, and threw it with all the strength of a Spartan warrior trained to throw javelins since childhood. The rock flew through the air and struck Mardonius right in the forehead. The Persian general fell from his horse and died on the spot. And with that simple act, the entire Persian army lost direction. The immortal guards continued fighting for a while, because that's what they were trained to do. But even they stopped when news of Mardonius's death spread like wildfire through the ranks. Let me be clear about this. This wasn't about superior technology or overwhelming numbers. This was about leadership. Mardonius had chosen to lead from the front, placing himself in danger, and that decision destroyed his army. One stone, one throw, one death, and 100,000 warriors suddenly didn't know what to do. The Persian formation began to break apart. What started as an orderly retreat quickly became a panicked flight. Thousands tried to run back to their fortified camp across the river, but Athens blocked the way. Sparta pursued from behind. Artabazos, one of Mardonius's sub-generals, saw the disaster unfolding and did the only sensible thing. He led 40,000 troops under his command off the battlefield and ran toward Thessaly, hoping to reach the Hellespont and go home. It was a wise move, but it also meant the rest of the Persian army was left to face their fate, and that fate was brutal. The remaining Persians ran into their fortified camp, thinking the walls would protect them. But Pausanias was in no mood for mercy. He ordered an assault on the camp, and when Athens and Sparta finally broke through the walls, he said 3 words that would decide the fate of thousands. No prisoners. This is the part where I have to be straight with you. What happened next wasn't warfare. It was a slaughter. The Persians, trapped in their own camp with no escape route and no commanding general, fought with the desperate courage of men who knew they were about to die. But the Greek phalanx, with their blood hot after more than 10 days of tension and a year of nurturing hatred since Thermopylae, could not be stopped. When the sun set on August 27, 479 BCE, an estimated 40,000 Persian troops lay dead. Greek casualties? Herodotus says only 159, though the real number was likely higher, perhaps 1,000 to 10,000. But even with the highest estimate, the casualty ratio is unbelievable. And here's the part you might not know. On that same day on the coast of Asia Minor, the Greek fleet defeated the remainder of the Persian navy at the Battle of Plataea. 2 twin victories on the same day. Persian military power in Greece was completely annihilated. The empire that had conquered from India to Egypt, the empire that had defeated every enemy for nearly a century, was suddenly driven completely out of Greece and never returned. Thermopylae had been avenged. Leonidas and his 300 warriors could rest in peace. But the story doesn't end in glory for Pausanias. In the following years, he was accused of plotting with Persia, accused of trying to betray Sparta. After multiple arrests and releases, he finally fled into a temple, where the Spartans sealed him inside and let him starve to death. A disgraceful death for the man who commanded the greatest victory in Greek history. But regardless of what happened to Pausanias, the victory at Plataea stood firm. It saved Greek civilization. It allowed Athens' golden age to flourish, the era of Pericles, of Socrates, of democracy and philosophy and drama. All the foundations of Western civilization we take for granted today exist because 10,000 Spartan warriors stood and fought instead of fleeing that morning. Alexander the Great, nearly a century later, openly acknowledged that Plataea had paved the way for his own conquest of Persia itself. Let me ask you this. Do you think Pausanias was a traitor, as the Spartans accused, or was he simply too successful to survive Spartan politics? Leave your thoughts in the comments. This is one of the most fascinating questions in ancient history. But here's what I want you to remember from this story. Plataea wasn't about numbers. Persia had more troops. It wasn't about technology. Some scholars even argue Persian armor was better than Greek armor. It was about 3 things: discipline, leadership, and purpose. Discipline, because when Pausanias said stand and fight in the middle of a chaotic retreat, 10,000 Spartans did exactly that without hesitation. Leadership, because Mardonius died and his army collapsed, while Pausanias lived and his army held firm. And purpose, because the Greeks weren't just fighting for land or plunder. They were fighting for the survival of their very civilization, for the right to exist as free men and to avenge those who died at Thermopylae. That's why 10,000 defeated 100,000. That's why a simple stone changed the flow of history. And that's why we're still talking about this battle 2,500 years later. If you want to hear more stories about battles that shaped history, subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes a single battle really can change everything. And Plataea was exactly one of those battles.